Welcome to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating, kind of complex academic toolkit called historical criticism. You know, if you've ever stopped and wondered how modern scholars actually study ancient, sacred texts, the ones that literally shape our laws and cultures today, without just blindly taking every single word at face value, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to unpack the exact tools they use, the massive controversies they spark, and the whole wild history behind the process.
All right, let's kick things off with a massive foundational question. How do experts actually peer through thousands of years of history to analyze ancient text without bias? Seriously, think about it. How do you look at a document that has been copied, translated, and culturally absorbed over millennia and figure out what it actually meant to the people who originally wrote and read it? Well, that monumental task is exactly what historical criticism is all about.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll define historical criticism. Second, we'll compare it to the grammatical historical method. Third, we'll trace the evolution of the method. Fourth, we'll look at seeking the literal meaning. And finally, we'll tackle the big ones: neutrality, truth, and falsehood.
Okay, let's jump right into section 1, defining historical criticism.
The absolutely crucial thing to grasp right out of the gate is that historical criticism isn't just one single tool, not at all. It's actually an umbrella term for a whole toolkit of interpretive methods. You've got source criticism, which digs into where a text originally came from, form criticism, which looks at the oral traditions behind it, and redaction criticism, tracking how the text was edited over time. And what's really amazing about this? Because these tools rely on independent reason instead of religious dogma, it literally allows Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish scholars to all sit at the exact same table and objectively investigate a text's origins, no matter their personal faith commitments.
To really get this, think of the word historical in two totally distinct ways. First, imagine a mirror. In this view, the ancient text reflects the specific cultural and historical setting of its own time. Or, second, imagine a window. Here, scholars are looking through the text to evaluate the reality of ancient events. This window approach makes it possible and honestly necessary to judge whether the historical claims the text is making are actually true or false.
Moving right along to Section 2, Historical versus Grammatical Historical.
Now, when we compare historical criticism to what's known as the grammatical historical method, we are basically looking at two entirely different starting lines for reading the exact same book. Historical criticism actively interrogates its sources, using independent reason, questions traditional authorship, and evaluates the hard truth or falsehood of claims. On the flip side, the grammatical historical method operates within a much stricter theological framework. It's an approach that basically assumes a unified, inerrant scripture right from the start, and it generally accepts a much more conservative assessment of who actually wrote the texts.
All right, Section 3, Evolution of the Method. So, how did this whole toolkit develop? Well, we can trace it way back to the 15th century with a Renaissance humanist named Lorenzo Valla. Valla did something wild for his time. He used pure language analysis to prove that a massive imperial edict, the donation of Constantine, which supposedly gave the Pope dominion over the Western Roman Empire, was actually a total fake. He noticed Latin words in there that didn't even mean what they were supposed to mean until centuries after it was allegedly written. Then, boom, we hit the Enlightenment in the 18th century. This era brought a massive realization of just how huge the cultural gap is between modern readers and ancient texts. And finally, this all culminates in 19th century German academia, where Leopold von Ranke pioneered modern objective historiography.
And von Ranke had this beautiful overarching ideal for the 19th century historian, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. Basically, to reconstruct the past exactly as it actually was. Now, sure, modern scholars will probably tell you that perfect 100% objectivity is impossible. But von Ranke absolutely established the gold standard here, the tireless effort to separate the hard, historical facts from all the myths and traditions that just sort of piled up over the centuries.
Which brings us to Section 4, Seeking the Literal Meaning.
The main goal here is to establish the literal or plain sense of a text. And let me tell you, this is way more intense than just reading a modern translation. Scholars have to do a deep dive into ancient semantics to figure out what a specific word meant in its exact original historical moment. It also means cracking the code on the social conventions of ancient genres. An ancient historical text simply doesn't play by the same rules as a modern biography you'd pick up at the bookstore today. Scholars literally have to decode these ancient conventions to uncover what the author actually intended to say.
But here's the catch.
Finding that original authorial intention is incredibly tricky. I mean, who is the author of a text that was compiled from a dozen different sources over hundreds of years? And what do we do with oral traditions that morphed and changed during transmission before anyone bothered to write them down? Then you have later insertions. Take the famous Christ hymn in Philippians 2, for example. Scholars actually think Paul inserted that into his letter from an entirely separate earlier source. And if that wasn't enough, literary critics warn us about the intentional fallacy. That's the idea that even if an author explicitly tells you their intention, it doesn't actually limit or dictate the final complex meaning of the text itself. It's like a giant puzzle.
All right, on to our final section, number 5, neutrality, truth, and falsehood. So scholars essentially use this method like a rigorous cross-examination to separate historical truth from falsehood. They don't just take ancient claims at face value. They actively interrogate texts to expose pseudepigraphs, which is just a fancy word for forgeries. For instance, no critical scholar today actually believes the first man on earth wrote the Apocalypse of Adam, and a lot of them heavily question the traditional authorship of 1 Timothy. They also hunt down logically impossible claims. A great example? Revelation 22:20 promises an imminent return, but it was written around 90 CE. Historically speaking, that imminent return obviously didn't happen in that time frame. The method demands that we ask these hard questions. Now, this brings up a really intense philosophical divide about how this method is used and whether it can ever truly be neutral. On one side, you have Joseph A. Fitzmyer, who views historical criticism as a neutral, objective tool that can totally be paired with Christian faith presuppositions in a positive way. But on the exact opposite side, you have Ernst Triltz. He views the whole method through these radical, highly skeptical principles that strictly exclude any kind of supernatural intervention in history whatsoever.
Let's unpack Fitzmyer's approach first. He argues for a very structured 3-stage method. The first 2 stages are super-rational. You uncover the textual meaning, and then you discover the historical contextual meaning. Basically, you treat the Bible just like any other ancient book. But then you hit stage 3. This is where he establishes the relational meaning, or biblical theology, and brings personal faith back into the picture. So for Fitzmyer, objective reason and faith can actually work together in cooperative stages.
Then we look at Ernst Triltz, who is on the complete other end of the spectrum. He excludes the supernatural entirely, using 3 really radical principles. First, the principle of criticism, which argues that absolute certainty is just impossible. All of history relies on degrees of probability. Second, the principle of analogy. This one says that past events have to mirror our present experience. So if we don't see literal miracles breaking the laws of physics today, we have to assume they didn't happen back then either. And third, the principle of correlation, which claims that history is a completely closed, unbroken continuum of cause and effect. So for Triltz, a historical explanation literally cannot involve the divine. No exceptions.
As modern philosophers like Van Harvey have pointed out, pure, 100% perfect objectivity is most likely an illusion, simply because we all bring our own societal subjectivities to the table. Which brings us to the end of our explainer and leaves us with a pretty provocative question. Knowing that every single one of us is shaped by our modern worldviews, can the historical interpretation of an ancient text ever be perfectly neutral? Or is every reading of history, at least in some tiny way, a reflection of the historian just looking back into the mirror? Well, we'll leave you to chew on that. Thanks for exploring the deep complexities of historical criticism with us, and keep questioning what you read.